All right, as we roll through the mechs and units that really make that pirate list click, the things that kind of set it apart, the things that make it successful, and the units that I really like, I want to highlight one of the heavy hitters in that list, and that's the Heavy LRM carrier. As you know from that list review, the Atlas and the Heavy LRM carrier are the guys that are doing your damage. Those are the units that are laying down the hammer while everything else kind of runs around, acts as a distraction, grabs objectives, and plinks, right? But that list does not work without something really chipping away at your opponent's units, because the light mechs on their own, if you got 10 of them, each shooting one shot, like it's going to take them forever to chew through even a single unit, right? So the Heavy LRM carrier is a way to get hits or get shots on the board. The other thing that it does is it allows you to place shots anywhere on the board that you need them to be, because you have so many eyes and ears. And in general, that's kind of the purpose of IF, right? Of indirect fire. And the Heavy LRM carrier is bringing a lot of that to the table, right? That IF5 is a big number. And at only 31 points, the Heavy LRM carrier is very efficiently bringing those to the table. So it's 31 points. I often will run it at skill 3 or skill 2. At skill 3, it's 37 points. At skill 2, it's 43 points. It's got 0 TMM and only a move of 4 track, which is a big drawback for this unit. It can't get around. It can't get on top of hills. It can't get through woods. It can't do anything. And basically, you deploy it at the beginning of the game, and you just go stationary to get that stationary bonus, and you just start blasting. It's got a total of 6 health at 2 armor, 4 structure, so it is kind of weak on the armor side. And then it's got a damage of 355 when indirect fire of 5. It's elementary engines for what it's worth. The only other thing that I like to point out in this is that it is turreted with that 355 and that indirect fire, which means you can spin that turret around and still be able to shoot with that indirect fire. So if something does get behind you or you get out of place, that's super helpful. Whereas you have units like the regular LRM carrier, which do not have turret. Now, so the pros in this, of course, are that indirect fire. It's just fantastic, right? You're dropping 5 shots every turn. You don't have to see the target. You just have something else see the target. Even if you don't have a dedicated spotter, you're just force multiplying by having cheap IF in your list, and you can really bump up your damage output by having something like this in the list. And stuff has a hard time hiding from it, right? Because if someone's trying to like build a double hill or use buildings as cover, all you got to do is have one guy see them, and suddenly this unit that is totally out of the picture and is stationary and has a low skill is dropping very reliable hits on that target. Now, the con to this is going to be that it is abysmally slow. I mean, just 4 track, you ain't going nowhere in the game. You are not grabbing objectives unless it's an objective that you're starting on, and even then with its low HP, you're not sticking around for a long time. It's got 0 TMM, which honestly, the 0 TMM is also a pro. It's a con because every time someone shoots at you, it's going internal, right? It's cracking off damage. But because it's a 0 TMM, like you might as well just park it and go stationary and get that stationary bonus. The other con to this is it's really only available to a handful of factions. It's a periphery unit, which I think is hilarious. This ginormous hulk of a vehicle is just like periphery general. And like all the periphery states are like, I see your LRM carrier and I raise you even more LRMs. It's also mercenary because, everything is mercenary. And in later eras, the Capellans and some of the Free World League factions can take it as well. So, in the game, it's dedicated indirect fire. That's all it's being used for, unless there's an objective in the backfield that you need to sit on. If you're playing something where you do have objectives that are close by your deployment zone, it could be used to temporarily hold that objective, because it will die very fast if it's exposed. You really need to hide it. If you throw this thing out in the open, you're not going to be, your opponent will not let it live, right? And so if you're playing one of those really light mech units, if you want to lean into your team in 3s and 4s and go light and go with lots of speed, maybe it's a hover build, maybe it's a VTOL helicopter build, This is a way to kind of force multiply and get some good damage up while everything else kind of is in your opponent's face, running around, getting in their backfield, distracting them, and drawing their units away from the LRM or the heavy LRM carrier. He is a unit that can help, get some damage into a list that might not otherwise have damage. Now, there are some other, you start talking about, doing that strategy where you're using indirect fire to add some extra damage to a list that doesn't have a lot, or just to get some reliable shots downrange to prevent your opponent from hiding. There's lots of other options for indirect fire, and I just wanted to compare some of them and kind of look at those units as well as alternative options. But kind of look at why would I select the heavy LRM carrier in the periphery list other than some of these other options. Now, a regular LRM carrier is 22 points, so it's 9 points cheaper, and it's 6 track. So it goes a little faster. You can move it around if you need to, but it's also only 5 HP, and they do die very quickly, and it's only indirect fire 3. Now, one of the problems that I have with regular LRM carriers is that they're not turreted, and I've had that turret save my bacon quite a few times with a heavy LRM carrier. Even if it's not surviving the attack from that hovercraft or light mech that gets in its rear, because you're on the backboard edge, and because they have to get so close, and oftentimes they're trying to get rear shots so they can multiply their damage, you can just turret that thing around and direct fire it for a short 3, and you end up doing very well. One of the things I also want you to consider is, like, if you ran 2 regular LRM carriers and got your indirect fire ability up to 6, it would cost you 44 points at skill 4, but for 43 points you can go to skill 2 with a heavy LRM carrier and be at IF5. And I think that's just better. You're going to be connecting more often. You're saving a point. You're not taking up an extra spot in your list, because one of the things when you start running lots of indirect fire units, because they want to be stationary and in the backfield, is like you start cutting into your total number of allowable units in the Wolfnet format. So that's something that to keep in mind. The 3055 upgrade on the LRM carrier is 32 points. It's indirect fire 4. So you're actually spending a point more for this thing. You're going just as slow. You have less health at 5 health total. Really, you got no turret. Really, all you're getting is C3 slave, and I just don't think it's worth it to pick up a C3 slave system for 1 point more and then to be IF4 instead of 5 with no turret. So if you have the option between the two, I think you take the heavy LRM carrier. The WOB version of the LRM carrier is 35 points. It's 6 track. It also has no turret. It's 5 HP, but it is IF5, and you do get C3I. So if you're doing a C3I build, that might be worth the points. You're a little faster, so you can get up on a hill, so you could direct fire, but you are very vulnerable at that 5 HP. This is really a WOB unit, and I know WOB doesn't even have access to heavy LRM carriers, but if you're comparing the two, there's kind of a difference there. Now, my all-time favorite indirect fire unit is the Partisan heavy tank with the LRM refit. You know that. It's 30 points. It's 6 track. It does get 1 extra HP. It's 344 with a 4 indirect fire and a turret. Now, the list that you're running and why you might run these units is different. I like the Partisan heavy LRM carry because it has that 6 track, and it has a little more health at 7, so it can get on top of a hill. It can direct fire, which means I don't need a spotter if I'm direct firing, and then it also means that if something does try to hide, I can still indirect fire. So it's more of a Swiss Army knife of indirect fire units, in my opinion. So I think those two are pretty close. Even though you're losing an indirect fire, you're picking up that movement, picking up that armor. You still maintain turret. It is a point cheaper, so sometimes saving a point makes a big deal. If you want to go into some other units that are very heavy into the indirect fire, you're looking at like a Jess 2. They're very expensive at 48 points. They do bring 10 HP to the battle, but they're skill 4 for that 48 points, whereas a heavy LRM carrier, again, at skill 2, you're only spending 43. The Jess is still slow. You are getting ECM. You are getting IF5. You are getting that C3 slave system in there, but I don't know that it's worth it for the points, just because it is so expensive. If your only reason to bring it is to drop indirect fire. If you're using that Jess and you're wanting to like kind of move around a little more, and you're using that HP to be to to do direct fire attacks and using that HP to be survivable, you might consider it. But that Team M0, it's going to bleed really fast, and nobody's going to want to let that thing survive very long. So the heavy LRM carrier, especially if you're a periphery player or mercenary, is a fantastic option for indirect fire and getting that into unit. And if you are considering running a light mech list or a light mech list build, don't be afraid to include something like this to increase your damage output and to kind of get your numbers up, because otherwise you're going to be really lacking in that department. And if you're really leaning into light mech build, it's almost better to lean into something like a heavy LRM carrier than to a bunch of like assault mechs that are equally slow that can't get on objectives. Like, just lean into the LRM carriers, run the light mechs, run all your spiders and your fleas and your locusts and stuff, and then use them to kind of move around, outmaneuver, get in the flanks, but then also to spot and drop these IF in there. Hope you enjoyed this. If you have experience using indirect fire or using heavy LRM carriers in particular, let me know in the comments below, and may the blessings of Blake be upon you.